So welcome to this week's episode of Leaders on a Mission, where I'm joined by inspiring leaders driven by the impact of creating a healthy and sustainable world. Now, in today's episode, I'm joined by Ali Wing, CEO of Oobli, a mission-driven food tech company that is bringing sweetness and health to the market with its innovative sweet proteins. Ali, thanks so much for taking the time and coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent, and it was great to meet you briefly last week at the food tech event as well, and never got a chance to try some of the Oobli chocolate. So unfortunately,
to get those sent to you.
But that will be great. That will be great. But look, maybe we'll just take it back. I mean, you've had a really fascinating career, and I just, as you stand there today, what are some of the, I suppose, early upbringing or the key forces that really help shape, influence who you are right now?
I always feel like I start with my family because it had such a big imprint on the who that I am. And it's been a huge part of why I've made the career moves and some of the bets I've made. So I come from a big motley crew of a family. I'm one of 10 kids. We have 4 biological and 5 adopted. So we represent the world from an ethnicity and a culture point of view. My parents were kind of first, my dad's the only one in the generation ahead of me to get a college degree. And I like to say sort of we come from, people don't often identify this as culture, but if you know old farming America, which was very Protestant, it was very sort of like, what's his name? Anthony Burrell's famous quote, work hard and be nice. To people, that's the culture of old farming Protestant America that was also the ones that did early adoption and thought about the world and its composite and loved the idea of the melting pot of America. And I was raised that way. And that had a galvanizing influence to me of sort of don't be afraid to take risks, work hard and have this love and fascination with people, right? And people of all different walks. So fast forward to, a career that started with Nike that was all about how do you build the emotional connection with a brand to what I've sort of threaded through my whole career is taking that early healthy living and always paired that as part of my mission. And as I've gotten older, I've been less negotiable about making sure there's a mission or an impact reason for what I do. And that still goes back to my early roots, right? If you're going to work hard and be nice to people, do it in a way that matters to the world. And that's still a huge part of who I am and has had a big imprint on how I've led my career.
Yeah, amazing. And look, you had such a broad range of career. I think there was a bit of law in there. There was there was a startup kind of branded company. There was Nike. There were digital and marketing roles. It just seems like you've done everything, really. So, maybe just touch upon, like as a CEO going into, I'm almost viewing it from the world of now, you're going into a pretty early stage company, as it were, as a CEO. And I'm thinking, well, what are the major things that you've taken through some of your journeys that stand you in good stead for this role?
I mean, I think to do startups at any stage, you have to be a learner and you have to be curious, right? You have to be comfortable with, you're always going to be in roles that extend sort of what you know, and they're going to exceed sort of the limits of what you know. So there's this fundamental curiosity that you have to do sort of what I do, which is not only moving industries, but moving stages of a company. And it's really critical if it's early stage. I would say the other big thing is, I'm in food tech right now, and it's a very nascent industry. And while there's incredible innovation in science and technology, even the biggest, most successful companies coming out of it are still relatively little and have a lot to figure out. So it's actually the perfect model for the type of industry I come into, which is one that actually hasn't been figured out. And you have to innovate as the industry is figuring it out, not just a new company within it, because it takes advantage of the pattern sort of recognition of having moved across different industries that if you just grew up in one industry, you probably don't have. Because you kind of have to be skeptical of everything within the core of that industry, yet pay respect and learn what elements of the food industry are going to be applicable. And if you were going to ask my lead investors, Vinod, Khosla Ventures and Vinod, he would tell you my type of background, which a lot of people look at and say, wow, she's moved across 5 industries. She's been at different stages. My strength is I can come in and help craft industries because I've moved and I see that pattern recognition across. And he's very intentional that the last skill set he would bring in is somebody who comes from food specifically. You have to be somebody that can actually challenge what you see in this industry in order to actually help be part of how you catalyze its growth. And that's the stuff that turns me on, right? The common denominators in my career, there's always got to be technology that's part of the unlock. You know, I fell in love with that. And there has to be a consumer prop at the heart of it. And for me personally, I like to think that if I'm going to build scale, I'm going to have big impact. So impact in a social or economic or environmental way. And of course, at Oobli, I think we're doing it on all 3. So that's my sort of cherry on top for this role, is it really is getting at all of those.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say that. What came to mind for me was, you know, sometimes people query if one person's worked at one company for too long. Here, I'm just thinking of Vinod and the view that you could work within the industry, but if you only have an industry dimension and the industry has been operating at a certain way, how can you disrupt it?
He's a very big, yeah, because you think about food tech, and I say this all the time, it's going to be a Venn diagram of at least 3 industries for the right model, right? So it's part biotech, which has huge pharma influence, but is different. It's part CPG, but it's different because you're leveraging a tech platform and a tech multiple for disruption, right? And then it's partly going to be either retail to consumer to ingredient. You don't really know. You've got to kind of look at all of those. And the reality is it's unpacking that, which requires some agility to think across industries. And that's sort of my best fit.
Yeah, different business models, as it were.
Yep.
Flexible. Yeah, there's been a lot of talk over the last 5 years on the, I've never heard this before, but B2B2C, almost. You know, that's been the buzzword within the within the space. That has been the case. And but you mentioned technology. I mean, the stuff that you did before, it was, very digital, right? I'm right in thinking. When you think technology now, and you look at biotech, and you look at the scale-up process, and you look at fermentation, that must be that must be some learning in the role when you've got to deal with that.
It is. For my, I'd like to think my PhDs around me would all tell me I'm getting an honorary degree right now. And that goes back to that early comment, is you have to be a learner. You always have to be willing to be the dumb one in the room on certain topics, right? And be pretty comfortable with that. But you mentioned early in my career, my law degree. And part of that was influenced by me being a small town kid and this kind of early generation of education. So some pressure to have a professional degree. But I also think if you look at legal training and the most common sort of, particularly on the corporate securities and analytics side, it's a very similar thought process to engineers. And it often is why you're partnered a lot with complex areas. It's a very similar learning skill set. And so when I came out after my years at Nike, I went and got my MBA. And when I was doing my business degree, I actually specialized in decision sciences, sort of the data application that was coming out of the digital world with consumer, and then did a law degree. I left there and went to the Silicon Valley after that and said, I practiced for a while, but then I actually worked for several startups in technology, some software as a service, some technology platforms, some consumer products with a tech play. So I did a wide range. And the reason was it was that combination of skills, is understanding the business model side of it, but being really comfortable in a different language than was my own language and being able to parse that quickly. So biotech is definitely its own beast, but I was at healthcare last, and healthcare has got its own technical capacity, particularly in the US. So I sort of view that as the arc of what has always been a little bit of my turn on in this, is I get to learn new data sets and I apply a very similar thought process to how you problem solve to understand it.
Yeah.
Now, keep in mind, I could never join this if I didn't think there was an incredible tech team and leader. And my partner here, Jason, is I know Simon, you know him. He's been in the industry for a long time, and he's very much, he would say, if he were talking with us, he'd say, we're photo negatives of each other. I am to the consumer that he's to tech, and we speak a very similar analytic language.
Amazing. Yin and yang.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me though, what about the the company you set up? Am I right in
Giggle?
Yeah, Giggle. I mean, because you were a co-founder of that business and had that for a number of years, right? So had you always had this entrepreneurial, I want to be a founder, I want to set something up? Well, was that always, you think, going to be part of the journey?
I don't know. I think there's no question that I'm a creator, right? I'm a creator and a builder. I always say, I have moved into large companies multiple times. I sit on boards of large public companies, but my seat is the one to drive change and to see where the puck is going. That's just who I am. So I don't know that I have to be a founder bug, but because I've been willing to work for founders, be the founder, work for a CEO, be a CEO of a founder. Like, I've sat around the table in a lot of different roles. I think the common denominator for me is the creation and the what of what we're doing. But yeah, I was hugely influenced by what I did with Giggle, and I'm a lot smarter, I think, as a CEO of a growth company, having actually, blazed the trail of a founder CEO and gone from the 0 to 100, right? And seen what that was like. It makes me a better leader now. I learned a lot of things from that.
Yeah. What do you think, like, well, off the top of your head, I'm sure you learned loads, but what did you really, what comes to mind?
I would say the single biggest bright light that I always keep sort of in mind from that founder time is that when you're in a founder role and the CEO, you can get a little too close at times. I used to say I recognized in retrospect when I would white knuckle things. And the effect of that was forgetting the age-old lesson of great leadership, which is great leadership is never about knowing everything. It's always about hiring great people around you and then building this sort of framework for shared success. Every once in a while, as a founder, you can trip on that and get too close to thinking you have to be the sole source. And the reality is I learned as a founder, it's that principle of leadership is no less true. It's even more true. And now I would say that is just a deep part of how I lead, which is never to walk into a room thinking that the questions that are going to get posed are for me to answer, as opposed for me to assemble the right team to have the framework for figuring it out together. And that's a fundamental thing that I don't think I knew with that articulation at that time. And I just think I'm very sort of focused on that as a result of that experience.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, very interesting. And probably allows you to therefore move industry quite a lot more, with ease, knowing that you don't have to solve every single problem yourself.
Yeah, I always say to people, like, I do work with a couple very large companies, and most of the people that are successful in very large companies have mostly been in one industry. And, the thing that you have to have a lot of sort of, I would say, confidence or ego in, if you do what I do, is when you move across industries. I've got the same duration of, let's say, a 25-year career as my peers, but I've done it in 5 industries. That means I've moved networks 5 times. So I build skill set, but you walk network. And when you're in one career you have a very deep network, but you're likely much more narrow in that skill set, right? But you have a very rich network. I say you have to kind of be really comfortable with the fact that you're going to walk in and re-meet and re-engage and re-establish. And people don't necessarily, you walk into the room and people don't necessarily give you the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Pros and cons, maybe, with something like that, right? Yeah, you're always needing to learn, for sure. And for sure,
some might say that's particularly think of it today as me as a female CEO in biotech. Right?
Absolutely. Well, you can get away with it in Silicon Valley. I'm not so sure I see that profile in Europe at all. Europe, we're a little bit behind the, maybe, I don't know. We're still breaking down the corporate kind of worlds and developing larger ecosystems, as it were, for startups here.
I think that's right. Even in the US, if you think about the initiatives that large public companies are going through to think about how do they change the pipeline of who defines the ideal board. and how do you get diversity of skills? The way you do that is you have to kind of flatten what you view as the right skill set. And they're going, I mean, US companies are going through that maturing process right now. I agree with you. I think Europe's more foundationally that way. So even its startup culture is still struggling or evolving in that sort of appetite, if you will. I would say I kind of feel I got lucky, right? I grew up and cut my teeth at Nike. I love consumer and brand, and I grew up and cut my teeth as one of the greatest brands ever was taking over world dominance, right? So I got to grow up there. Then I went to graduate school, and then I was smart enough or lucky enough, probably a combination of both, to drop myself into the Silicon Valley in the mid 90s and just grow up as that was growing up, which I think that industry was then defining some of our best in class practices of innovation. And I would say my hallmark strength was I ate it up. I ate up everything there was to learn in both of them. And I saw them as sort of the extension of my skill set rather than two different things.
Yeah, timing's
everything.
Is everything. Yeah, exactly. So tell me about Oobli, specifically about the challenges the company's solving.
So at the highest level, this goes to your B2C to B and sort of how we think about how we'll commercialize it. But if we step back and say, what are we trying to pull off? What's our mission? Our brand purpose or reason for being is we believe that sweets should be as good for your body as they are for your soul, right? Because when you think about the role of sweets in culture and human and consumers and consumption, it's one-to-one correlated with every one of our happiest memories, right? It's our holidays, it's our celebrations, it's our birthdays. But if you look at a lot of data today, there's an incredible amount of guilt in all of that because we think about what our grandma's favorite recipe was actually made of, or, the struggle of health and diet today, right? So there's this kind of great juxtaposition of happy celebration that we've kind of lost as we understand that maybe we're not making the best choices with what we've put into our bodies, right? So we want to unlock that, right? Completely conflicted. And Oobli done right will give permission back to sort of access to healthy sweets and go back to having the fun in all your happy celebrations. And that's what we aim to do. Why can sweet proteins do that? And why am I so excited about it? And I alluded to this in kind of the triple win is when you look at the market today, we don't just have climate and food supply issues, which are true in a lot of industries, right? But we have this dominant consumer demand. 2/3 of consumers, if not 75%, self-report actively looking to reduce sugar. And when you look at the statistics throughout the world, North America, South America, India, Southeast Asia, you have on average 40% of the population is pre-diabetic or obese. And, staggering health issues where a lot of those people are walking around with the kind of virtual equivalent of a prescription from their doctor to get on it, right? They have to address it. But you look at what we have over the last 20 years, you've had a lot of innovation in sugar or sugar alternatives, not a lot of health improvement, right? You could argue the trend has been reverse. But the bigger thing is you haven't had sort of that holy grail of it tastes like sugar. And so when I step back and say, what's the what for Oobli? There's an already existing demand to re-engineer how we satisfy our sweet tooth. We don't really want to give it up. We're hardwired to have it. It's pretty natural to crave it. But our bodies don't like it, the reckless abundance we now have as sugar in our diet and arguably sugar alternatives, number one. Number two, but to do that and not to make us change habits, there isn't many that are allowing us to satisfy that taste, right? They're a definite taste compromise. And then third, holy grail, if it can also be ones that we definitively know change our health as well as change goodness for the planet, both of which we believe sweet proteins and precision fermentation can do.
Absolutely. Sounds great. Yeah, it really is the holy grail, isn't it?
It is.
And yeah, and tell me where, where's the company kind of got to on the journey?
So before I joined the founders who spent almost 6 years building the tech, right? And I'm going to step back just a minute, give you a little history of sweet proteins. The scientific community has known of sweet proteins as found in nature. There's about 20 of them that we know today for about 20 years. But really nobody's ever been able to produce them. And if you ever tried to grow them from an agricultural point of view, they'd be a climate disaster. And they'd only be available for very few because they grow in very precious ecosystems and they make one tiny little protein, right? So we've known about them, but we've known about them academically. We haven't really been able to put it to test, right? So Jason, my co-founder and our CTO and very much my partner, as he would say, my work spouse.
Jason Ryder, legend, isn't he? A legend of the industry.
He is. And he's a huge part of why I've made this bet. He's very much my partner. Spent 6 years building out how could you actually produce these to make these a viable rehabilitation tool and diet. And about a year ago, I was brought on by Jason and his investors to then be his consumer partner to say, all right, now how do we bring this to market and make this available within the food supply? So step number one is a lot of work where he ended up getting to this idea that the best way to produce these at scale is precision fermentation. And that is really sort of our tech platform. And today, milestone number one is, of the 20 proteins out there in the world, we research all of them. We have about half a dozen active on our platform. And we just got self-GRAS on our first protein in the US. And we, about 3 weeks ago, launched our first products, chocolate. And we're just a few weeks away from launching our big first category in drinks.
Fantastic. That sounds great. Congratulations with that. Because, yeah, I do remember a few years ago, I think maybe initially you were trying to grow it as a crop or trying to harvest it. Well, was the move to precision fermentation, did that come a little bit later, as it were, on the evolvement?
You know, we are 7 years in and Jason was on this for 6 years. And I think by the time he was in his second year, he had landed on fermentation as a strategy. But I think they did evaluate the role of potentially doing some transgenic crop development. And they explored some of that in their early R&D.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. I mean, it's fascinating biotech, isn't it? I mean, most people think of biotech when it comes to, you know, pharmaceutical, but, you know, you've got these tiny little things. And I know I've seen and heard some of the research, some of the big flavor companies have done on this over the years. And, you know, you've got these tiny little things in random places. They exist in nature, right? But you just, you know, as you say, they're tiny. And all of a sudden you're using precision fermentation to bring this to scale. Now, how challenging, I mean, just looking at it, how challenging an issue is that, I think, first of all, in terms of, you know, being able to kind of scale that process? I know Jason's not here, but just as you as an expert looking at it, yeah, how challenging is that?
You know, I give complete hats off to my partner in this, but I don't lose any night's sleep worrying about our ability to do mass accessible scale production for the world's needs in sweet proteins.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is I partnered with a very experienced scale fermentation operator. And so he's built it at scale in many other applications before. So he was always doing the early research with that mindset. And I think that's a difference. It's not a good or a bad, but it's different for a first time ever scientist doing it. He'd actually built big scale for large companies. So I think his early R&D was much more attuned to what that scale would look like.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would say, if you just kind of step aside for a minute and say, all right, think of precision fermentation, which mostly is defined today by the meat and dairy players, right? There's not very many doing sweet this way. We're cousins in that there's similarities from a sustainability and a planet for all of them. But one way that's very different for sweet proteins versus our meat and dairy cousins is the fact that sweet proteins on a weight basis are 2,000 to 5,000 times sweeter than sugar. So there's an incredible leverage in the techno-economics of scale, because an example that I would give you is, I'll take a really American one, so bear with me for a minute, but let's take like a middle of the country big drink. Let's take an orange crush, a bright orange soda that's 16 ounces. That has the equivalent of 17 cubes of sugar in it. So you can have that visual pretty clearly. Just imagine stacking up 17 cubes of sugar. In a drink, the only role of sugar is just sweetness. It doesn't play another functional role. So the rest is just water. So if you take an orange soda, I could take out 17 cubes of sugar and replace it with about 0.03 milligrams of a sweet protein, just based on the leverage of sweetness on a sweet protein to a sugar. So when you translate that to scale, I get incredible efficiencies as we scale, and fermentation is very well suited for that. Why it's been used for years in food, right? Like beer and wine, same idea. But the actual protein we're doing has this incredible sweetness, so we get that additional leverage.
Yeah.
So scale is actually something we're actually producing today in 3 different countries. Where we have to produce a ton of volume to go through the regulatory standards of every country. So we are in the kilos by a lot. And just to give you an idea, just a kilo of any one of our sweet proteins could probably do a large national CPG line's one beverage line for a whole year, right?
Wow.
So it's a lot of sweetness.
Absolutely amazing. Okay, and so what does it taste like then? I mean, like so your first product, the chocolate, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the product.
Well, our goal for the chocolate is really for the first time, people have talked about sweet proteins for a while, but nobody's ever eaten it, right? So just taste a great chocolate. What should our chocolate taste like? A really good dark chocolate. Shouldn't taste like anything that's unfamiliar to you. Shouldn't taste like a reduced sugar chocolate. We still put a small amount of, we do an organic cane sugar in it, just for the upfront sweetness, because until we're working with more than one protein through the regulatory process, we can drop the sugar without changing it so your brain notices, right? So it's a different taste by about 70%. When we're working with multiple proteins, we can drop it by about 90%, and we should be able to hold the taste profile that the consumer's already used to.
Got it. Okay. So you've with your background, I'm sure you've done probably loads of testing around this, and you've got loads of data and analytics around this, I would have thought, right?
All I've done for my last year and a half is consumer test, right? Where does it work? How do they understand it? Where is it easy to understand? Where is it more complex than it needs to be? And how do we match where they already are? I'm a big believer that the much greater thing that keeps me up at night is not, can I scale the tech? We're well past that at Oobli. It's how do I make it easy and trustworthy for consumers who have generally, and I'll speak with a little bit of an American bias right now, have generally lost their way with labeling and the 50 forms of sugar, as evidenced by the fact that if you do market research, 75% will say they're actively reducing it. And if you look at their health records the last 20 years, that doesn't bear out to be true. So there's a gap, right, in what's working for their bodies and what's not. And there's sort of a loss of trust around labeling and food manufacturers right now. So for me, those are the bigger risks to worry about, is how do you get above the noise and make it easy for somebody to find out that actually proteins are a pathway to sweetness, not just energy, and they should ask more of their protein. And that's where I want to play.
It's a paradigm shift, isn't it?
It is.
You're thinking about your protein, like the idea of having a chocolate bar and actually, trying to make your protein grams and your numbers up by having a chocolate bar around that. Actually, that's yeah.
And the trick there is that we're not a good protein loading source. Remember, it's 2,000 to 5,000 times sweeter, so it's always going to be a very small amount.
Yeah.
So that is a little bit of, people trust proteins. There's a halo around protein. We're very keto friendly. We can reduce sugar a lot. But we're not going to increase the amount of protein on a nutrition fact, because it's always going to be the smallest ingredient, because it takes a very small amount. So it's more keto friendly than it is protein loading. And sort of what I keep challenging with consumers is they need to ask more from their protein. Proteins aren't just energy. They're also can be sweetness.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about, so in terms of where do you see yourself taking to market? How are you going to distribute and sell, the chocolate? What's the plan for that?
Well, we're super excited about our chocolate, but our really big first product launch is drinks. And I'll tell you a little bit about why. And that's probably the better one to talk about sort of distribution. So when you step back and look at the problem of sugar, and you look at daily added sugar in the world, this is true globally, the biggest problem or category that's the culprit is how we drink our sugar today, right? Whether that's a Starbucks line or your favorite soda or what you add to your tea. We tend to overdrink sugar today. And when you look at sort of the daily added sugar consumption, it's about 40% of total sugar comes in the form of our beverages. So for a bunch of reasons, we said, all right, that's the 800-pound gorilla. Let's go start to introduce drinks. We're debuting our first category, sweet teas. And think of that from a brand in the US, think Honest Tea, Snapple Tea, Arizona, where most of the drinks, if you buy those ready to drink off the shelf, they're going to have anywhere from, on the very low end, 20 grams of sugar to the average is probably 32 to 36. And the
added sugar, right.
Yep. So there'll be 20 to 50 grams of sugar per drink.
Yeah.
And what we're excited about is we're going to give you that same sweetness across the same fruit flavors with about 75% less sugar. There'll be about 5 to 6 grams of sugar. Right. And most of that sugar is the fruit. A very small amount is added, and we just use a little bit of agave to help round out the flavor profile, so it tastes very familiar to what you've always had.
Got it. Okay. And you're bringing that directly to the consumer.
Yeah, sorry, distribution. So we are launching, we have a heavy emphasis in our early years on D2C, not because we're not going to use channels, but a couple things. One is, as we move through the regulatory process with each of our proteins, we have self-GRAS, then we have no questions affirmed. The bigger the retailer, the more likely they need us to be at that next stage with the FDA. So it's also kind of a timeline thing. But at the same time, we know we're not only introducing a new protein, a new product, we're introducing a new category. People don't know sweet proteins. So a lot of what that is today is education around a new category. And therefore, today's modern branding, that education happens the same way you get it. Things like podcasts, YouTubes. It's very digital in its execution because it's very content heavy, so that we are talking with people to help put a spotlight on why is this so special and why is this such a game changer, potentially for our health, but also for our planet, right? So it'll have a big direct distribution. So everything that I've talked about that we have today and that we'll have soon is always going to be available online. And that's everything from our website to Amazon to major marketplaces like Thrive. You can find it all digitally available everywhere. The next most important category for us is restaurants. And the reason for that is restaurants have target markets, right? So when you think about a digital communication, we can be focused on, hey, if somebody's already looking at protein loading, we're going to talk to them a little bit different on how to educate than if there's somebody who still wants their Dunkin' Donuts, but would like to do better. We're going to talk to them a little bit differently. Restaurants are like that. They're already segmented. So we can present in a environment in a restaurant more to a target market so that it's more effective for them to understand this new product.
Absolutely.
Last and certainly not least will be shelves. And what I mean by that is retail. And we have plenty of retail today. We're in small retailers like pop-up grocers, some of the early natural foods grocers. But I actually don't think when you're introducing a category, you really teach brands on shelf. That's usually where people find it after they understand it. So that's really our third step.
Yeah, that would make great sense. Tell me, with the no, I'm no technical expert, right? But is it easier? But when you're replacing sugar, because I've always heard that the challenge is, if it's so sweet, the challenge is what else do you fill the product with? That's always been the challenge, right? How do you fill it in? Is it less of a problem with a soluble beverage, therefore?
It is. So remember, when we think about the foods as the model food system, right? So every different category. And whether you're talking about a protein that's sweet or a sugar alternative, which every sugar alternative today, by the way, is a small molecule, not a protein, which means it's absorbed differently in the body, which is why it's got a glycemic index and a gut microbiome. That's why we're so excited about protein just being totally different. But what you know about that is by category, it's different. So in drinks, the only role of sugar is sweetness. It doesn't have a bulking or a functional role, right? A different role. So probably less relevant to how intense it is. It's just that you don't have the other roles of that ingredient. you just have sweetness and the rest is water. So you can modulate and adjust a formula rehabilitation much quicker, right? On the other end of the spectrum, and I say this to you because we were just talking about it, is a chocolate bar. In a chocolate bar, 50% of the weight of a chocolate bar is usually sugar, right? So when we formulate here, we're replacing sweetness, but we then also have to look at what do we replace the functional bulk that sugar played. And in this case, we have to then add an ingredient. And here we're adding chicory root fiber. So we're really trying to make sure anything we do in our products, if we add in a bulking agent, it's going to be one that is gut healthy and not a backdoor to diabetes. So it's got to be a very clean ingredient approach. But that's going to be true baked goods, sweets, anywhere there's a big functional role that sugar plays in addition to the sweetness.
Got it. Yeah, it sounds like more complex from a food science perspective. Yeah. Okay, no, great. That sounds very exciting. Tell me, what are the dreams? I mean, it sounds like, you know, when you think about the challenges with sugar and the challenges with obesity and, you know, the issues with consumer labeling and, you know, it's a long journey, right, for people to trust and believe. And, well, where's your hopes and dreams for Oobli if we're having a chat in 5-10 years time? What's possible?
I'm going to tell you my big dream, right? Which, by the way, I very much share with Jason, my co-founder and partner, and I also share with our lead investors. That we all aligned on why are we working on this? Because arguably we could all go work on easier things, right? The big dream is to put a dent in the global sort of health crisis of obesity and diabetes, right? The dream is to have a true rehabilitation tool that satisfies the mind and mouth, which we know has to happen together for people to adopt something, but actually then runs through the body in a game-changing way, because we have a health crisis. And I would argue it's every bit as big as our climate crisis. My favorite thing I always tell my teams, I'm very much here and excited about being part of the climate solution, but I always say, if 50% of your population is suboptimal health, you're not going to solve any world climate crises. Like, we actually have to get it both together. And so that's our reason for why we're doing this. At a very practical level, most recently, I was within the healthcare world and I was responsible for a big growth company and unlocking growth. What I quickly realized is once you're actually in the US healthcare system anyway, there's really no motivation to get you off sort of the medicine that corrects things. And I just desperately wanted to be more preventative and to go back into something. So I think to ground a little bit more simply, what we think we're trying to pull off is one of the great first proof points that food can be medicine, right? We actually can shift a small molecule approach to how we satisfy our sweet tooth to a large molecule, which is protein, which is a game changer for how it affects our body. And that's really a food as medicine strategy that we're all pretty deeply aligned around.
Amazing. So something to wake up every day and come to work motivated, and it sounds like linking climate with health is a great calling, as it were.
It is. I feel very lucky to wake up each day to climb this mountain. It's a mountain to climb because our global food supply is structured very differently today. And I don't view any of that as like the enemy we're after, as much as the opportunity we have to unlock a different type of benefits that creates sort of a all boats rise opportunity. And that's what I think we're up to with Oobli.
Fantastic. So tell me a little bit about, because you're very big. I know I've read some stuff. I'm going to have to cut this bit out. Sorry. My dog is barking. Hold on one second. Just give me a second. Hey. Sorry, Ali. One sec.
No worries.
Did you hear her, by the way?
I don't hear at all.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah.
I saw your little person coming in and out the door, but I could hear nothing on that side.
All right. Well, I'll make sure I make a note to make sure I edit that out, that bit. And so, yeah, look, I suppose to finish off with, just having some sense. I know culture, building team and culture, really close to your heart. So tell us a little bit more about, what's important to you in building a culture, and then how you go around doing that.
No, I know we talked a little bit about this at the very beginning about sort of the roots of who I am, right? So we sort of say, work hard and be nice to people. At the end of the day, life's too short to work really hard in an environment that isn't also a happy place that you want to be a part of a team. And I wake up every day with a few principles. One is I like people. I like to work with people, number one. Number two, I don't have any sense that anybody has all the answers, particularly in what I'm doing right now. But in general, I think that's true. So there's always going to be a team is smarter than the individual. And three, the sort of practical mission that I try to bring together as a CEO in that role is really the servant leader model, right? Which is how do I help everybody else find their best success? Because in almost every scenario, that's going to be positively correlated for the results of the business. And that's kind of what I wake up to do every day. I wouldn't pretend to say I'm perfect at it, but I think that there's a natural affinity for it because of who I am and how I was raised. I tend to think the world operates that better, better together. And I believe in that principle. So whatever management style I put on it, that's just probably who I was long before I had a management term for it.
Great. Okay, look, great stuff. Look, Ali, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing. I've really enjoyed it, and can't wait to taste the chocolate and drink the juice. So best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. I really appreciate the conversation, and we will get you chocolate in the mail.